morning, everybody. We at the Documentary Heritage and Preservation Services for New York, thank you for joining us today. Our topic for about the next hour is on ethics. This is Claire speaking. I am an archivist with 16 years experience in the field, mostly in not-for-profit institutions, a little bit of state government, and a prior career in vertebrate paleontology, which is how I discovered archives in the first place. It's a pleasure to present for DHPSNY today, and I'm delighted to have you along for the session.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Brandon Zimmerman, and I have been involved in archives, libraries, museums, etc. for about 15 years. I started off as an exhibit designer, and from there have gone into curatorial studies, research, and working very closely on both sides of archival research and administration, both as staff and again as a researcher. So really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you folks today, and this should be really informative and fun.
Excellent. I do need to point out that Brandon's photo is actually from a modern tintype that photographer Andy Song took of him. So it's not just another smartphone shot. Documentary Heritage and Preservation Services for New York, DHPSNY, is a statewide program that supports the vast network of unique library and archival repositories that safeguard New York's historical records. As you know, DHPSNY provides all free services to eligible cultural institutions throughout the state, archives, libraries, historical societies, all of which operate programs to preserve and make accessible records of enduring value. Normally, well, as with all of our DHPSNY educational opportunities, our target audiences are the staff, volunteers, and other professionals of the over 4,000 not-for-profit institutions throughout the Empire State, as I mentioned, that collect and make available unique recorded information. Normally, our audience for these webinars we think of as smaller repositories looking for a few basic do's and don'ts. Usually, folks have limited staff, often part-time, often volunteer. If you work at a place like the State Archives in Albany, you're probably familiar with 26 miles of records, proprietary barcode system, 35 archivists on staff, and fleets of researchers in the reading room 6 days a week. And normally, I would say that you probably don't need a DHPSNY webinar. However, we're talking ethics today, and ethics applies to all cultural heritage professionals, archivists, registrars, curatorial assistants, curators, staff, volunteers, anyone charged with handling materials that are in the public trust. So the ethics apply whether you're a staff of one or even the New York State Archivist with a staff of 70. Image sums it up. It's the branch of moral philosophy that asks the question, is this right or is this wrong? And it may not be fair to assign ethics to a cat near a vase, but it makes a relevant point. It's clearly not right to intentionally knock a vase over for no reason. Thus, Mooch the cat is acting in an unethical manner. It's important to know that law and ethics are not synonymous, says Karen Benedict, a highly regarded expert on archival ethics. You will see her book and other resources in our resource list that we'll get up after the webinar when it's posted online. Benedict says, law and ethics do not always complement each other. It is possible for an action to be legal, but clearly unethical. It is also possible for an action to be ethical, but illegal. Karen Benedict offers the following examples. A legal but unethical issue could be a senator accepts a large campaign contribution from an organization that has regulatory legislation pending before a congressional committee that the senator chairs. No laws were broken, but at least it seems unethical from the outside. She has an example of something that's ethical but illegal, which I think is really neat. And that might be if a doctor discloses information about a birth mother to an adoptee. in a state where all adoption records are permanently sealed by law. So let's jump into codes of ethics. And I'm going to take 1 second here and outline the fact that Brandon and I are going to, we really want your input for the duration of this webinar. We may break and pause and read your questions, or we may, owing to time, we may just need to address them at the end, but please keep them coming in. And like I can see here, somebody wrote, Ashley wrote in that casts have no ethics, and you know, she's right. Okay, jumping back to codes of ethics, I pulled one off the interweb, which is the Code of Ethics for Engineers, because it's really just a great example of what, you know, codes exist to unify a profession, to instill public trust in an organization or a group. In this particular Code of Ethics, we will read, and I don't expect anyone to read this, but it says basically engineers must always consider human safety as a premium. So kind of important. You can search any interest group you might have and see if they have a code of ethics. They're certainly not required, but they do help bring together thoughts on what is right and what is wrong. Here's one for the American Institute for Conservation of Historic and Artistic Works. And this is more typical, this is very typical of codes. They're enumerated or they mention pretty much what is expected of a professional. For example, number 1, the conservation professional shall strive to attain the highest possible standards in all aspects of conservation, preventative conservation, examination, documentation, treatment, et cetera, et cetera. So these are very much familiar, regardless of what organization you're in. Codes pretty much have the same idea. Here's one for the librarians out there. You probably already have memorized this, the Code of Ethics of the American Library Association. And it's about intellectual freedom and equitable access to materials in a library's care. I'm just going to jump down. I like number 4. Oh, my numbering's all messed up. Well, the third one up says, we do not advance private interests at the expense of library users, colleagues, or our employing institutions. That's a very common theme as well. We're going to spend some time on the Society of American Archivists Code of Ethics. And here's where Brandon and I are going to sort of tag team. We're going to discuss what the code is meant to suggest, and then we want to bring in real-world examples. And we've just picked a name randomly. We're going to use all of our examples about somebody named Bob in air quotes. But these are real examples, but all institutions are hypothetical. So beginning with the Code of Ethics for the Society of American Archivists, this code is designed to provide guidance to archivists, increase awareness of ethical concerns among archivists, their concerns, and the rest of society. As advocates for documentary collections and cultural objects under their care, archivists aspire to carry out their professional activities with the highest standard of professional conduct. That all sounds pretty good. The behaviors and characteristics outlined in this Code of Ethics should serve as aspirational principles for archivists to consider as they strive to create trusted archival institutions. And these are the groupings that the Society of American Archivists, I'm going to start saying SAA, Code of Ethics breaks into professional relationships, judgment of the archivist, authenticity of the records, security and protection of the records, access and use, privacy, and trust. Very common themes among codes of ethics, certainly in cultural heritage. Let's start with professional relationships. Archivists cooperate and collaborate with other archivists and respect them and their institution's missions and collecting policies.
Now, before we continue, like Claire mentioned, it's necessary to point out that if you've turned in if you tuned in order to get a list of sort of immutable, strictly enforced sort of commandments regarding archival ethics, you're either going to be very upset or very happy, because like she mentioned, there's really no such thing. It's guidance, right? These codes function to aspiring principles for archivists to consider as they strive to create trusted archival institutions. And again, we're going to tell you about the Code of Ethics, these lists here, and then these real-life examples. But again, like Claire mentioned before, really would love to hear from you if you have any questions or any anecdotes you'd like to share, because the more that we can sort of discuss these things, the more you get a better understanding, especially if you're a smaller, institution that might not have, established mission statements or collecting policies, et cetera. So with regards to professional relationships, as we mentioned here, archivists cooperate and collaborate with other archivists and respect them and their institution's missions and collecting policies. And this doesn't necessarily just mean exclusively to sort of respect thy neighbor, right? Just to stay friendly. To expand this concept of respect a little farther, respecting the collecting policies of other institutions and the appropriateness of what you collect and what your other institutions, either near you or just globally, are collecting, this concept is really vital to the infrastructure of cultural institutions. Now, obviously, there's going to be some overlap in terms of what, let's say, you collect versus what other institutions collect, but sometimes we find ourselves thinking that a way in which we could perhaps reach a larger, more diverse audience, right, which is something that's very important these days, is by diversifying our collections. And while, again, a great thing, this can get a little tricky in some instances. Be careful that you aren't just diluting or venturing off the path of your organization's mission. If, for example, your institution collects records and or artifacts of, let's say, a 19th century New England whaling vessels, it wouldn't make a whole lot of sense or it'd be appropriate for you to accept an accession, let's say a painting by, Andy Warhol of Campbell soup cans, no matter how much it's ultimately worth or how much you as an individual, let's say, enjoy pop art. And more about what to accession, how to accession, mission statements, etc., taking a little moment here, is featured in some of the other webinars, so not to get too far into that, but to get a little bit more granular with this concept of respecting, the ethical respecting of collecting policies, again, from an ethical standpoint, let's use a real-life example. So let's say you live in a city, you work in a city that has an archive of natural history and also has one of anthropology, okay, two separate institutions. You work at the Archive of Anthropology. A collector, let's say Bob, comes to you at the Anthropology Museum and says that they want to donate a collection of photographs. And these photographs have to do with, let's say, African exploration, turn of the 20th century, indigenous peoples. Sounds very promising for your collection. Bob sends you copies of these images, scans of these images, but when you look at them, you actually notice that the bulk has to do with the collecting of natural history specimens, birds, mammals, etc. And only a small handful of this collection, very small handful of this collection, has really anything to do with the mission statement, with the content contained within your archive that would relate to your specific collecting institution. Now, while Bob is interested in donating this collection to you, let's say because of the particular prestige of your museum, he knows you, etc., given in terms of the scope and appropriateness of your mission and the likelihood of it being used, right, because we want it to be used, we want it to have open access, this collection ultimately is better served going to the Archive of Natural History. So respecting those boundaries, respecting, having knowledge of other institutions and being able to understand your collecting policies, not just to collect for the sake of collecting, but to have those ethical guidelines motivate you in that way is very, very vital.
As you can see on the screen, archivists also have to be professional with their donors, records creators, users, and colleagues. Of course, and being an archivist, I can say, naturally, we are all honest, fair, collegial, and equitable, but sometimes it doesn't hurt to be reminded. Judgment, that's a very important term, and it's not something we're born with, certainly. Brandon and I have talked about various mistakes we may have made in our careers in the past, but we learn through mistakes, and we learn through current literature and from our colleagues. So archivists exercise professional judgment in appraising, acquiring, and processing materials to ensure the preservation, authenticity, diversity, and lasting cultural and historical value of the collection. And archivists should carefully document their collections-related decisions and activities to make the role in the selection, retention, and creation of these records transparent to their institutions, donors, and users. And I have 2 points. One, this cracks me up, this box. Somebody definitely documented a decision, which is that the box needs a label. But to make that a label cracks me up. And on the other hand, a colleague in Albany has said, just be sure, even if we're making mistakes, document them.
So in terms of judgment here, again, with the archivists exercise professional judgment in appraising, acquiring, and processing materials to ensure preservation, diversity, and specifically the lasting cultural and historical value. And that's really an important aspect of the judgment point, right, is cultural and historical value. And let's be honest, not everything has such. And the example I'd like to give here, I'm kind of going to put Claire on the spot to tell you a story. We worked together at an institution with regards to the appraisal portion of a collection. And this particular sort of real-life event involves the office of a very famous, very established scientist who retired and kind of left their office almost sort of time capsule-esque, right? Just left it exactly how it was on their last day. You know, walk out, seal the door, you know, and there it's left for years and years and years and years. Papers everywhere, desk chairs pulled out, you know, became sort of a shrine of sorts. And, you know, so years and years later, we go in to clean up, collect materials for the archive, and on the whole, as you know, we know published materials don't necessarily go into the archives. You know, photocopies, tons of photocopies don't really go into the archives. You know, old Chinese menus, which were strewn all over the office, don't necessarily go into the archives. So the process of beginning to go through and establishing what was historical and of cultural, you know, value, you know, began. And it's important to point out that also, in addition to these things, some of these materials had mold on them, old food. It was opened up a cabinet. It was with some papers in it. There was a bottle of ammonia and bleach and, you know, things, and, you know, water damaged again. So to the point of illegibility. So how do you go about, you know, sort of ethically determining what shouldn't go into the archive here? So in addition to that, we had some staff members who, you know, without sort of understanding some of these guiding principles, decided that, you know, everything should go into the archive. And I sort of watched as Claire was going through and culling both what should go into the garbage and also what should be going into the archive. And I'll put her on the spot to kind of tell the story of what happened as she was deciding to throw some things away.
Well, anyone in my position has had to do that, toss, shred, or keep, or possibly relocate. And in this case, I had a huge garbage bin, and like Brandon said, this is a nasty, nasty collection of decades and decades worth of stuff. But naturally, there were gems, archival gems in there. And the junk that I was tossing included like magazine pictures that were on her cubicle wall or her office wall. So I was tossing all of this stuff, filling up bin after bin, and sure enough, after I left the room, I came back in, and there's some of her fellow scientists, mostly subordinates, who were pulling out the things that I had thrown away. And again, like Brandon said, there's no reason to keep 50 Chinese restaurant menus just because they were so-and-so's. So,
and yeah, and in the same way too of some of these things that you encounter in your archives, you know, I think all of us have you know, popped open a box and seen you know, 19 copies of the same publication and so forth, and you know, sometimes it is okay to purge, you know, again, within reason, doing so with knowledge and with purpose, and using these things as guidance to guide some of those purges, but don't do them willy-nilly, but just taking solace in the knowledge that one can do so is very important. And again, that being said, a discussion with those staff members, which we then had with those staff, as to why something that you might necessarily deem of no cultural value might in fact, why that item might be of significance or worthwhile to keep. Hey, you should keep this photocopy because, again, that's also part of that personal respect and knowing your community.
The State Archives itself puts out guidelines for all of these qualities to look for. So definitely check out the New York State Archives website. It's sort of like our own records at home. We know that we don't need to keep our tax documents after 7 years, but we sure do for those first 7. So similarly, you don't have to wing it on your own. All of these values are described in our literature, and the State Archives staff are very readily available. And you can always write to us at DHPSNY too. We're happy to help with your appraisal decisions. I will point out this photo here is one of my favorite pieces of recorded information. It's a spiral, machine-readable punch card sort of tape. Who the heck knows what's on there? We were able to find out that it contains information about oyster beds in the Delaware Bay. The last point is archivists are encouraged to consult with colleagues, relevant professionals, and communities of interest to ensure that diverse perspectives inform our actions and decisions. We have a question that's come in which Tina asks about Brandon's example, what if Bob only wants to give the collection to your institution? Possibly he had a bad experience with someone from the other institution. Well, that's absolutely possible. Bob would certainly make his feelings known if that's the case. It's his collection. He can do with it what he wants. And Brandon's point is that the archivist at the Anthropology Museum was literally like so attuned to the ethics that we share that he knew it's better, more appropriate to redirect Bob to the Natural History Museum. Now, whether Bob decided to donate it there or not, we don't know in this hypothetical, but based on real life.
And I would also add that in that instance, it would if you only had the opportunity to acquire it, if it was the choice of acquire it or he's just not going to give it to anyone, it's important to keep the collection together. You wouldn't, for example, want to say, okay, yeah, sure, Bob will take it, and then you take out the part that you would find relevant to your collection, and then send something else somewhere else. It would be very important to keep those collections together.
Authenticity. Archivists ensure the authenticity and continuing usability of records in our care. We document and protect the unique archival characteristics of records and strive to protect the record's intellectual and physical integrity from tampering or corruption. I'm sure this probably seems very self-evident, but it doesn't hurt to go through this, right? Archivists may not willfully alter, manipulate, or destroy data or records to conceal facts or distort evidence. I mean, my goodness, we're in charge of preserving the record. I can't even imagine somebody endeavoring to destroy that, but we know it happens all the time. Archivists thoroughly document any actions that may cause changes to the records in their care or raise questions about the record's authenticity. Security and protection seems fairly intuitive. Archivists protect all documentary material for which they are responsible. We take steps to minimize natural physical deterioration of records and implement specific security policies to protect digital records. We guard all records against accidental damage, vandalism, and theft. We have well-formulated plans in place to respond to any disasters that may threaten records. We cooperate actively with colleagues and law enforcement to apprehend and prosecute vandals and thieves. Does anyone have any questions they want to write in we're absolutely happy to take them.
With regards to security and protection, this is another one of those sort of obvious ones, right? But it is also quite difficult, as we all know, with regards to some of the security and the protection, especially when it comes to environmental conditions, because we're essentially all at the mercy of our storage units, right? We're at the mercy of our exhibition spaces and storage rooms, offices, our reading rooms. So a lot of folks, some of you are housing your archives in historic homes, for example. Facilities like this rarely have state-of-the-art HVAC systems, right? So reasonable alternatives to some of the daily issues affecting our collections, things like temperature, humidity, light levels, some of the overhandling, integrated pest management. Again, some of those things are covered in other webinars, but there are some of small ways in which you can quickly, cheaply affect change regarding your collection. And even if you can't necessarily affect it, just, again, that knowledge, that guidance, right, being able to act responsibly, ethically with regards to that can really help, especially when it comes to things like environmental conditions. So things, again, obvious ones, turn the lights off when your archives aren't in use. Don't store archival documents in the same spaces as staff. Don't eat or drink in archives processing or storage areas. Possibly place dark sheets or blankets over your display cases if they're exposed to light, particularly daylight. And then when it comes to things like security, we have a tendency to just think of the security from visitors, from users. But from the security standpoint, you really don't need to turn your archive into Fort Knox, right? Nor do you need to become some kind of watchdog. The institution of just simple checks and balances, ensuring that all staff, docents, volunteers, etc., everyone who encounters your archival documents are aware of sort of the rules and regulations regarding them. And you can address any questions to prevent any kind of misunderstandings. Again, very obvious thing, but I can't tell you how many times I've gone in both as staff and as researchers, and sort of the rules aren't necessarily explained up front. They really only become a factor once someone does something that is sort of against those rules. But one of the ways, one of the very simple ways of enacting sort of security protocols that I've encountered is to just add a simple checkout system, a simple pencil and piece of paper checkout system. So anytime something is removed from your archive, you know who took it, you know the date in which it was returned. I'm sitting next to someone who instituted that system, so she's smiling at me. But that really, I've never encountered that, outside of Clare and I working together. But if it's something you do, bravo. And if it's something that you don't know, consider it. It's so simple. It takes so little time, and also facilitates the easy return of the collections. But then if someone needs to use those collections again, you can go right to that list, see what they pulled, when you pulled it, and it makes it for easier pulling. That is assuming that you are functioning with a hand-made pulling system. You're not using computer systems like Aon or what have you.
Brandon's exactly right about all of this, and it reminds me of a very simple example where a photo lab in a museum that I know of, let's just say Bob was a volunteer there and was told never, never, never put your fingers on the glass plate negative. And we want you to wear gloves, Bob. Please wear gloves. And so Bob finally understood. It was explained, and Bob wore gloves. And we literally saw Bob on a lunch break wearing his gloves, eating chips. So maybe he didn't quite understand. He certainly wore the gloves, but I guess the point was missed. Also, we want to point out that there's no penalty for institutions that don't have the funding. We do what we can do. We're not all fabulously wealthy institutions with, as Brandon said, HVAC systems that are flawless. But every bit of logical common sense, we do what we can do. Again, DHPSNY has addressed so much of this in their webinars. Do check back. And finally, to Brandon's point about having a checkout system, if you don't have Aon or barcoding systems, you can do a simple checkout. But one thing that also drove me nuts is a real-life situation when my staff member, whose name we'll just say was Bob, checked out materials for a researcher, and then I went through and looked at the checkout list to see, what was at the end of the day, what was back in. And I knew the researcher was still out in the reading room with the collections, but I saw on the checklist that it had been checked back home, checked in. So I asked my staff member, Bob, I don't understand, why did you check this back in when it's clearly out in the research room? And Bob said, well, I knew I'd bring it back at some point. It was just easier to do it when I checked it out. So you gotta make sure your rules make sense, but also explain them if they don't seem to catch on. Here's a huge component of many of our related codes of ethics, be you a museum curator, an archivist, a librarian, whoever's in charge of these phenomenal cultural heritage collections. The only reason they exist is to be used, not to be stored away, not to be locked away. They exist to be used. And that, of course, exposes your collection to all kinds of dangers and perils, but it's also vital. So we have quite a few points on access and use that I'll speed through, and then we can talk about examples. We also have some questions coming in. One from Susan says, do you have information on how to collect and archive digital files that, quote, live in our computers? And she continues, we have our early paper collection, but don't know how to begin with our last decade of digital files. And I'm very happy to say that I can point you to DHPSNY webinars. Please check our list. I know we had an excellent presentation by Bonnie Weddle of the New York State Archives on digital preservation. So that's in there. It lives online with our webinars. Another question, please, from Douglas. Please address some specific policies to protect digital records. Oh, similarly, I will have to point you to the experts in the field. I'm not one, but DHPSNY has those resources available for you, DHPSNY.org. So yeah, recognizing that use is the fundamental reason for keeping archives, archivists actively promote open and equitable access to the records in our care. There's an archivist hard at work doing that for researchers. Archivists minimize restrictions. We maximize ease of access. And again, think even if you're like the curator of the salt grinder collection, salt shaker collection, or the pepper grinders, this is your job to maximize ease of access where possible. We facilitate the continuing accessibility and intelligibility of materials in all formats. We formulate and disseminate institutional access policies along with strategies that encourage responsible use. Doesn't this all sound good? It should. It's like what we aim for. Archivists work with donors and originating agencies to ensure that any restrictions, if any, that are appropriate, well-documented, and equitably enforced. And I have a real-world example where I was in the archives where I worked, and we had phenomenal special collections, and they included some polar gear from really well-known 19th century explorers. And a visitor came through on one of our sort of outreach tours, and he saw this material and said, oh, don't tell anyone about this. I'm a filmmaker. I'm going to write a movie about this, and I could get Spielberg on the phone right now, but no one else can see this. I'm going to lock this down. And I had to explain that these materials were not there just for him. So these situations arise. When repositories require restrictions to protect confidential and proprietary information, such restrictions should be implemented in an impartial manner. And in all questions of access, we seek practical solutions that balance competing principles and interests.
Obviously, conflicts with regards to access and just sort of the daily grind, they're going to arrive, right? They're going to arise. Anyone who works in a museum, library, or archives setting, they know especially that that our spaces, especially if you have a coveted space, you have a coveted reading room, when it comes to things like events, you'll know you're going to have to juggle researchers' access and the greater needs of the organization. In instances like this, it is really important to keep researchers informed of things like closures, changes in schedules, etc. Again, very kind of common sense stuff, right? Now, when maintaining certain challenges, such as, let's say, things like if some of you folks have off-site storage, accessing those things and sort of the dealings with those things can be challenging. Perhaps those collections are only accessible on certain days of the week. But if you begin to see things like a robust usage of a collection that is off-site or that is fragile in nature, consider things like digitization, photocopying, etc. What you want to try to avoid at all costs is assigning some arbitrary access privileges, especially things like fees, or making them accessible to only very specifically qualified researchers. Again, like Claire mentioned, it's really about equitable and open access. On the topic of fees, I know sometimes they're avoidable. I know that sometimes that comes from the top down, that one has to assign things like fees in order to access collections. Again, we're not all wealthy enough to be able to access these things, especially if they're off-site at any time. You have to cover your expenses, staff time, gas, etc. But again, just a careful caveat associated with this is just be careful when it comes to the assigning of fees in order to access your collections. Really, as soon as you begin to commodify the service component of it, you may encounter those who feel that essentially they're entitled to the best possible service. I paid for this, right? I'm entitled, right? The researcher becomes more of a customer. And to some extent, depending upon your fee, that's not wrong, right? They're paying for something. There's going to be a certain level of expectation. So just be aware, be mindful, careful when it comes to to the ethical charging of some of these things. A lot of times we want to assign astronomical prices because our time is precious to us and so forth. But just again, sort of be mindful of that should you need to do something like that. Another caveat would be sort of the language that is universally used a lot of times on either finding aids or on websites, that your collections are open only to specifically qualified researchers. And that's one that I see pretty much all the time when I'm going around to archives, qualified researchers. What does that mean, specifically? So, who dictates what classifies as a researcher? Naturally, again, we need to budget our time, our resources, but, when you think about it, as a college student visiting your collection to work on a term paper, should they not receive any more or less importance or access than a PhD, writing a book? So, again, just be mindful of some of the terminology. Also, when it comes to open access policies, don't change those policies just because a collection may or may not contain something that presents your institution in a bad light, something that contains something controversial, right? While there are various exploitative aspects that we need to be mindful of, and we can't get into the specifics here, but unless there's a specific law that prohibits access, let's say something like medical records, things of Native American, NAGPRA, things like that, one shouldn't bar access based on those contents, or most importantly, based off of one's personal feelings with regards to those contents. There are a number of places that at the very least engage in some of that behavior, refusing to access collections that present them in less than ideal light. It happens, it's going to happen, and for the most part, you as archivist, you as assistant archivist and so forth, you're not going to have any choice in that matter, especially if a large portion of your collection was accessioned, if there restrictions were placed on your collection before you came on board. The point is, again, these aspiring goals, the guidance that comes from the Code of Ethics is to know that these types of things, they're not the norm, they're the less than ideal circumstances, and that moving forward, one should use best practices to ensure the open and equitable access.
Privacy is a really huge, big deal, and it's something archivists recognize. Privacy is sanctioned by law. We establish procedures and policies to protect the interests of the donors, individuals, groups, and institutions whose public and private lives and activities are recorded in their holdings. Like your grandmother may have donated the love letters that she received to the local historical society, but all the letters were written by your grandfather and maybe others, and they had no say in whether or not their materials were ever going to be made public. So we do have to respect this, and I know an archivist friend in Albany who said, you know, it just feels like everything is private in an archive, and it absolutely can feel that way. We, as appropriate, we place access restrictions on collections to ensure privacy and confidentiality are maintained, and specifically they say, oh, what I just told you about individuals who had no role in their materials being put in archives. And notice our last topic was access, 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 and here we're like, ooh, privacy, privacy. It's an absolute yin-yang, very delicate balance. Archivists promote the respectful use of culturally sensitive materials, as Brandon mentioned, in our care by encouraging researchers to consult with communities of origin, recognizing that privacy has both legal and cultural dimensions. And we respect all users' rights. These are the researchers who come in to study our materials. We maintain the confidentiality of their research and protect any personal information collected about the users. And I think, Brandon, do you have an example on that one? Well, I'll set him up. I just remember Brandon has been a researcher, as he mentioned, and we protect researchers' information. And Brandon was doing some research at an institution and found out that the librarian in that case was sharing Brandon's research and his contact info with anyone else who had the same subject interest. So that is unethical. We would never do that. We can, however, ask a researcher, if somebody else comes along with the same subject, would you like us to let them know of your work? And that's often just to tick a box on your registration form when the researchers come in. So it's not that we'll purposely make sure no one ever gets in touch with each other, but we would never share a researcher's information. Trust. Archivists should not take unfair advantage of our privileged access and control. We execute our work knowing that we must ensure proper custody for the documents and records entrusted to them. Again, sometimes reading this just seems so obvious, but use the code anytime you have questions about an issue, and there's so much literature on archival ethics. We demonstrate professional integrity and avoid potential conflicts of interest, and we strive to balance the sometimes competing interests of all stakeholders. I think we've got some questions here. Oh, here's a good one from Jean. Charging for access. Thoughts on applying this to charging for copies, scans, etc.? Yeah. I'm personally just reviled by the idea of charging for access. I know it happens not only in archives but also some museums. If you wanted to get in and study the South American primate collection at a certain natural history museum, not in New York, you might be charged $60 a day. It's called a bench fee. That's ridiculous. And your question is, how about applying charges to copies, scans, et cetera? That, I think, our entire cultural heritage profession, I can't speak for everybody, but that seems reasonable. That's logical. Those are real costs. The most expensive liquid in the world is toner cartridge. So these are reasonable. We also, I know from having worked at the State Archives in Albany, they have a very clear mathematical formula of how much to charge for such copies. And we'll try to get that up in our resource list, but it was a very simple calculation of the staff member the clerk who does the photocopying. It's some rate based on their wage and how much of that time taxpayer money is needed. And Susan asks, if we have an online collection, do we black out names and addresses of people who have written letters, etc.? to your organization which we would like to share but not disclose? Brandon, any thoughts on that? That's a good question. An online collection, do we black out names and addresses? Well, I don't see any difference between online and physical, and if there's no reason stated in, say, the transfer memo or the deed of gift to indicate that these data must never be revealed, then I would not think we need to do that.
Yeah. I would agree that there wouldn't necessarily be any reason to redact a name or anything of that type unless there was some pre-established restriction. But then again, I think it'd be very difficult to redact certain information on a single page. It might be the type of thing that you would just not post that particular page. But there again, there would need to be some sort of established restrictions as to why you would need to do such a thing. And also in terms of your prioritization, right? Everybody has the priorities of what needs scanned. There wouldn't necessarily be merit to beginning with collections that have restrictions.
We have another question from Amelia who asks, what if Bob, the board member or staff member, has moved personal items into the archive as collection material? Things such as a chair or box of concert tickets. I'm sure these are strictly hypothetical. Fishing magazines, etc. And she asks, how do you say no? Yeah, that is a risk that happens. I've seen it. Brandon has seen it.
Feel your pain, Amelia.
It is. Well, I would jump out and say if they want to donate the collection, then they become a donor. And I think that's fine. I can't see any reason why not. If the collection in question is freely given, they've got rights and title to it, just like any other donor, as long as the collection, in your opinion, according to your mission, fits in your collection scope, then sure, why not? There's no harm in that. But what it sounds like to me in your hypothetical example is that Bob more or less was inserting collections of his own interest into the archive. And I would say that sounds to me like salting, the phrase salt. Make it a gerund, you've got salting. That's when people intentionally place materials into an archive. And it's hard to imagine. We're always so wary of theft and items being taken from the archive. But the corollary is people want to put things in the archive. And that is often because it lends legitimacy and authority to that collection. They can say, Bob can say, well, you know, my box of concert tickets is in the so-and-so archive. So it's very much to be handled delicately and in conjunction with all of your rules, regulations, and so forth.
And at the very least, you know, again, these codes, these rules that you can sort of fall back on, and at the very least, you know, there's that email you can send voicing your opinion. I mean, we've all been there in terms of you know, board members. You know, probably the most encountered thing was a collection that would be stored by a board member or so forth with the promise of one day, you know, one day they're going to donate, or hey, we're going to put this thing in your archive and we own 49% of it and the donor owns 51% of it, and upon their passing, they're going to give us their, you know, 51%. You know, there's always going to be those types of situations. But, you know, sometimes the only solace that we have is the ability to fall back on these ethical guidelines to say, well, hey, this is not standard policy. You are kind of veering off the norm. You know, making those ethical, you know, guides available to these people, voicing your opinion, and, you know, yes, 95% of the time, are you going to be overruled? Probably, but, you know, at least from your, you know, your own person, your own personal professional ethics, you know, you can stand behind those.
We've got another question. Camilla asks, she provides a scenario. Bob receives a collection without restrictions and finds Social Security numbers in a document. Does Bob restrict access to that material despite the lack of restriction? So sensitive material, personally identifying information, which I think is PII in our lingo. Speaking for myself, I think, yes, you would find a way to restrict that number. And one easy way would be you photocopy the document with the information on it, you put the original back, you take that photocopy, and redact using a big black magic marker anything that's sensitive or personally identifying, then photocopy that. So that is what you could provide to the researcher. So they get the whole context of everything else if it's appropriate. That's just one quick suggestion. We have more scenarios. Douglas says, some thoughts on equitable treatment to researchers. We allocate a basic 15 minutes to each researcher, which he says is a tax levy-based policy. That's absolutely fascinating. 15 minutes to a researcher. Okay, that's interesting. I've never heard of that. It certainly would cut down on those endless reference queries that could just never end, it seems. But does anyone else have any thoughts on that? Let us know.
Yeah, I've never professionally encountered that, and also as a researcher, I've never encountered that. But that is very fascinating. Thanks for sharing.
Holly points out, writing a collection policy that outlines what you do and do not accession, and moreover, a mission statement can help with donations that do not fit. Exactly. We know, Brandon and I know, let's mention somebody named Bob again. Bob seemed to enjoy being the center of attention at cocktail parties, where Bob would agree to accept all kinds of donations and then never discuss it with the archivist or the library director. Just literally the donation would show up at the doorstep with no information except that Bob said it was okay. So we definitely need to avoid those. And those policies are what we can lean on when we get pushback from board, staff, donors, directors, and so forth. We're just at 12 noon. I'm going to ask if Brandon has anything to add.
I mean, we could take a second and just to fall back on Camilla's earlier question. It dawned on me too with regards to, and Claire, if you could talk to just the concept of both control files, but also because we have been in situations where you encounter personal documents, within a larger, let's say, professional collection. Let's say you receive a donation by a still living author, right? They basically give you, let's say, they have a famous book. They give you a book in a box, right? It's all of their drafts, chapter by chapter. They give you all kinds of research notes in relation to it and so forth. But as you begin to process it, there in the middle of the collection, randomly you find, some, I don't know, steamy love letter, written to a paramour that really has nothing to do with the scope of the collection. Is that something that you keep in? Is that something that you should redact? Should you remove it? Should you alert the still living author to its existence, since this, again, doesn't really fit into, the collection? So I'm gonna toss it over to Claire in terms of, her thoughts on those types of things.
Yeah, Karen Benedict, the archival ethics expert I mentioned earlier, has a whole scenario about that. What if you took in grandma's love letters and from the 1910s, and lo and behold, there's Confederate paper money that actually has some value on the market. Now, did the donor know that was in there? Do you think that's part of the collection and lucky you get to keep it? Well, I guess, if it's all written over with a deed of gift, then yes, technically it belongs to your institution, but it would be the ethical thing to ask the donor if they meant to include that. I do have another example. I'm going to use a scientist named Bob. Back in the 90s passed away, and all of his collections, his archives, his personal papers were, as is typically done, shoved in a box and donated, transferred to the archives. And when we were processing it, this is sort of pre-internet days. Well, no, we were processing it post-internet days when I got my hands on it, but his collection predated the internet. And lo and behold, the last folder from the last file cabinet stored his magazine pornography collection. Little awkward. I am confident Bob, the scientist, never meant for that to be discovered, let alone accessioned into the archives. So that we did use a little discretion and thought it does not, clearly does not show the essential nature of his work to the institution. So yeah, you never know what you're going to find. And we'd love to hear some more from you guys if anyone has time. And thank you so much for joining us. Yes, Nicole, Catherine writes, poor old Bob. And, you know, we all have Bobs in our lives, love them or hate them. But the thing is, with the Bobs in the world, having your policies and procedures is sometimes the only way around wild cards like Bob. Nicole's writing, if someone donates something she knows wasn't hers to give, should we accept? That is a simple no. And I say that because the person who's donating is really obliged to own the collection outright. And that's where a deed of gift or transfer memo, well, deed of gift comes in handy with a donor, is that they are claiming they own all rights and all title to all property that they are donating to you. Now, if they know they don't, then they are violating possibly some laws, but certainly ethics. If they don't know, that's another story, and there are tons of very interesting articles about issues with donations that weren't fully owned outright. One couple of years ago in the American Archivist Journal followed some archivists and how much time, it was this case study, how much time would it take to document actual copyright in all of a certain collection. And they quickly found that the time far outweighed the practicality. So that's why the burden is put on the donor. Any other questions? Yes, Jacob. Bob from the Historical Society dropped off records of an orphanage that was run by a person who also worked at the college. The records are now held by the college. Ooh, how should access requests be handled? I would not have known how to answer that prior to working at the New York State Archives, but I've learned so much from the reference archivists there, who I would refer you to, of course, but since this is just hypothetical, I think orphanage records, depending on what state you're in, are protected by law. And by protected, I mean access is definitely restricted. So maybe if the orphanage, does the orphanage exist still? Would they like their collections back? Or are they now part of the college? And if so, I think the requests all about that should go straight to whatever state that is. The state archives could answer that for you. Well, thanks everybody. We're going to listen in. There's a couple more typing, but if you've got to go, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, and just one final thought here in terms of the ethical component. I'd like to say that if you're listening to this, if you've tuned in and you're aware enough to know that ethics are important and to pursue a higher understanding of your position within your archive, your museum, your library, you're looking to better yourself in this way. You're on the right path, and the trick is to really trust yourself. Again, I know so much of this is just basic common sense stuff, but sometimes we can lose focus, we can lose perspective with some of these materials. But again, sort of trust yourself in knowing that you're since you're aware of this type of material, you're aware of the ability to care for this in a better way. Again, you're on the right path. So bravo.
Wow, we got a real tricky question coming in right at the end from Kim. What if donor buys vintage photo album at antique show and the institution posts pictures on Facebook and find relatives? Do we have any issues with using or selling those photographs? I'm looking at Brandon. Brandon's looking at me. That's very relevant, very topical.
Yeah, I would say first of all, it's very topical. Some of you might be aware there was a New York Times article just yesterday, actually, with regards to a series of anthropological, ethnographic daguerreotypes, some of the very first that are in the collection at Harvard, taken by Louis Agassiz of slaves. He used it for ethnographic purposes, and there is a descendant who is claiming that as a descendant she has a right to own not only copyright and so forth, but also to own the actual physical daguerreotypes. And she is actually suing Harvard in the pursuit of trying to acquire these materials. And if you read the article, many lawyers who are involved in it saying it's unprecedented. Yeah, there's the New York Times article there. Thank you, Jacob. It's an unprecedented case, not only from the standpoint of a descendant trying to sort of reach back and reclaim aspects of their family's cultural heritage, but also sort of unprecedented in that aspect of who owns copyright of our identities, of our pictorial identities, and that's a tough one. That's definitely a tough one.
Is there anything else coming in from anybody? All right. Well, thank you, and we look forward to working with you again. Bye for now.